Today, Pokémon is the biggest media franchise in the world. With cards, toys, video games, board games, and even movies, Pokémon is known around the globe and played by millions of people every day. But most people don't know that Pokémon almost never made it past its inception. The Japanese man who invented it was originally rejected by Nintendo, who thought the game wouldn't make it in the market. Satoshi Tajiri was born on August 28, 1965. Born and raised in Tokyo, Japan, Satoshi's early life was normal. His father was a Nissan salesman, and his mother was a stay-at-home mom. They lived in a rural suburb of the city, and Satoshi spent much of his time outside in nature. When he was very young, Satoshi loved to hunt and collect bugs in the fields around his home. The hobby became a passion, and Satoshi decided he wanted to become an entomologist when he got older. The neighborhood kids called him Dr. Bug, but as with most childhood dreams, Satoshi started to lose interest in studying insects as he got older. Around that time, his small town was becoming more urbanized, and consequently, instead of playing in fields, he and his peers started hanging out at arcades. Young Satoshi started becoming just as interested in video games as he once was in bugs. He spent hours at local arcades in the 1980s playing every video game they had. In fact, he was so obsessed that he started skipping school to play the games and almost didn't graduate. Satoshi's parents were quite worried that he would never get a job as he spent all his time at the arcade and didn't seem to care about education or a career of any kind. He didn't apply to or attend university after barely graduating from high school, and it seemed like his life was at a standstill. With his parents' encouragement, Satoshi signed up to take courses in electronics at the local technical school, but his heart was still in video games. When he was only 17, he started writing and publishing a magazine all about arcade games called Game Freak. It included cheat codes, tips, and general information about all the games in his local arcades. And while it certainly wasn't a financially viable business venture, the magazine would actually change Satoshi's life. Ken Sugimori saw the Game Freak magazine and told Satoshi he wanted to get involved. He started drawing sketches for the publication. The two worked hand in hand for 4 years before deciding to shut down the magazine in 1986. By then, arcade addicts around Tokyo knew the magazine well, especially Ken's interesting and unique artwork. The two didn't stop making the magazine because they were done. They stopped so that they could prepare for what was next, something bigger and much better. Ken and Satoshi both studied programming before starting a new venture, making video games. The company was still called Game Freak, but it was an entirely different enterprise. The first few years were tough for the young gamers. Big companies such as Nintendo didn't want to work with two gamers who seemingly made games as a hobby, so they decided to take the leap and incorporate Game Freak into an actual company. The tactic worked, and Game Freak started making several games for some of the big-name video game companies in Japan. And within a few years, they were working with the one and only Nintendo. They released their game Yoshi for the Nintendo Game Boy, and shortly after, Mario and Wario. And they weren't solely working with Nintendo. Game Freak also created games for Sega and Sony, along with others. During this time, it's safe to say that Ken and Satoshi were doing well in their business venture. However, no one knew that along with creating and selling several games to the brands, they were secretly working on something much bigger than anything they had made before. While Satoshi was consistently making the games the companies wanted to buy, he was also working on a project that no one had ever attempted before. The inspiration came when one day he saw two Game Boys connected by a cable that allowed the two interfaces to work together on a game. The story goes that he envisioned little bugs crawling along the wires, and it reminded him of his early years collecting insects in fields. He thought that he could create a game in which players would collect creatures and trade them with each other. While the concept might make perfect sense to us now, it's important to understand that nothing like this had ever been created before. So when Satoshi presented his idea to Nintendo, even though they already had a successful working relationship, he was extremely nervous that they were going to turn him down. Surprisingly, Nintendo gave the go-ahead for the game, even though they questioned whether or not it would actually be successful. During development, Game Freak almost went bankrupt, as it was way more expensive to create than anything they had made before. In fact, they lost several employees during development because they couldn't pay anyone. Plus, it took much longer than they had anticipated because the computers they were working on often crashed, erasing all of the work they had done. Even though nothing was going right, and at every corner, it felt as though the game was going to fail, Satoshi and the team at Game Freak kept going until they finally created what they set out to make: Pokémon. In February 1996, Nintendo launched the first Pokémon game, with two variations, Pokémon Red and Green. The game itself included 150 Pokémon characters to catch, battle, and trade. And while Satoshi's innovative game had finally become available for the masses, they weren't sure if it would actually sell. At the time, Nintendo and Game Freak were worried about its popularity, as it had been 6 years since the Game Boy had been released, and interest in the device was fading. And they were right to worry. At first, only a few gamers were purchasing Pokémon, and sales were certainly not impressing anyone at Nintendo. Luckily, they didn't have to wait long. Within just a few months, and without any advertising, Pokémon's popularity started to spread. Gamers around Japan were enthralled with this new game, and were especially excited when they found out there were not 150 Pokémon, but 151. One character was hidden as an Easter egg that needed to be found, and everyone loved the challenge.
Challenge accepted.
Only a year later, in 1997, the Pokémon trading card game hit stores, and it was immediately successful. Millions of copies of both the video game and the card game were sold in Japan, and it was clear that Satoshi had been right. This was the game people wanted to play. In 1998, Pokémon was officially launched in the United States, called Pokémon Red and Blue instead of Red and Green. Nintendo, along with other sponsors, including KFC and Hasbro, spent a whopping $25 million on promotion and expansion into the United States. And it certainly was a risk. The Japanese company didn't know how the American population would react to the game, as it was different from anything they had marketed before. But luckily for the men at Game Freak, Nintendo, and the world of gaming, Pokémon was an immediate success. And when they released the trading card version of the game just a short while later, it was equally, if not more, successful than the video game. By the end of 1998, Pokémon wasn't just a game, it was a cultural phenomenon. The world was absolutely obsessed with both the video game and the card game, and sales were through the roof. By the turn of the new millennium, Pokémon was not just a game anymore. They had created a hit anime TV show and thousands of pieces of merchandise that they simply couldn't stock fast enough. Although many called the worldwide obsession with Pokémon Pokemania, others, especially parents in the United States, called it the Pokémon flu. The concern was that children were becoming so completely enthralled with Pokémon that they were missing school, distracting them from school, and even causing many children to spend their lunch money on cards instead of food. Pokémon cards were banned from hundreds of schools across the nation, and religious leaders spoke out about the demonic undertones of the characters, urging parents to refuse to let their children play the game. But even though leaders, parents, and principals tried to deter their children from Pokémon, their attempts were completely futile. The kids only became more obsessed. In 1999, when the first Pokémon movie was released, it made more than $160 million at the box office. During this time, Game Freak and Nintendo were working hard to ride the wave they had created. They continued to make new games for the Game Boy, such as Pokémon Yellow, and even a game for Nintendo's new N64 console. Pokémon Stadium, Pokémon Puzzle, Hey You Pikachu, Pokémon Gold, and Silver were all released within the next few years and led to record-breaking sales for Nintendo and Game Freak, with over 20 million copies. Over the next 15 years, it seemed as though nothing could stop the Pokémon franchise. The game makers continued to release new games every few months, and sales were impressive for almost every new release. But everything changed in 2016 when they created a game with consequences no one could have expected: Pokémon Go. This game encouraged players to get outside, as the game was a virtual map of the real world in which you had to literally move to new places in your area to collect Pokémon that were virtually waiting for you. It became a craze like none other before. In the first month, there were over 200 million players, making the company over $207 million. Eventually, the game made over $1 billion in revenue. This version of the game was, in many ways, Satoshi's original dream come to life, as he had always thought that the idea behind Pokémon was to catch 'em all, just as he had done as a child looking for bugs around his home. However, Pokémon Go proved to be problematic, as there were several issues with its development and actual play. In fact, the CEO of Niantic, the company who created the game, was booed off the stage at a Pokémon Go festival in the United States. But the Pokémon team at Niantic, Game Freak, and Nintendo kept at it, making adjustments to Pokémon Go as well as continuing to create merchandise, shows, movies, and video games. Over the course of the global pandemic in 2020, the world's love for Pokémon was reignited once again into an obsession, as people were playing online while stuck at home, and even watching and hosting online trades with the physical trading cards from their childhoods. Today, Pokémon is worth an amazing $92 billion, making it the world's largest and highest-grossing gaming franchise. Satoshi Tajiri, the man whose innovation and creativity led to this unbelievable and world-changing game, is still the president of Game Freak. He has a personal net worth of $5.1 billion, making him one of the richest people on Earth. To think that this entire franchise was created by a man who spent his childhood catching bugs in a field is pretty incredible, but it's absolutely true. Hungry for another fascinating business story? Click on the following video to hear the crazy story about the mountain climber who invented Patagonia with his last coin.